The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, and it's great to see you in that chair. And it is really an honour to rise in this House for the first time in the 44th Parliament. Before I speak to Bill C-2 and this government's out-of-control spending, let me take this opportunity to thank the residents of St. Albert, Edmonton for placing their trust and confidence in me for the third time. It is a great honor, indeed it is the highest honor of my life, to serve in this place, and a great privilege. And with that honor and that privilege comes many important responsibilities that I take with the utmost seriousness. And while it is not possible to thank all of those who helped me through the campaign, because there were so many, I do want to acknowledge and thank my campaign manager, Jeff Wedman, for his leadership. And most importantly, I want to thank my parents, Tom and Rita Cooper, who worked harder than just about anyone on my campaign. Without their steadfast support, I could not have done it. So I thank them. Now, Mr. Speaker, on to the substance of Bill C-2. Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that proposes to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars. Billions and billions and billions on top of this Liberal government's $635 billion spending spree in 2020, billions and billions on top of the $101 billion of additional spending provided for in last spring's budget. With this blizzard of spending, it is difficult to keep track of it all, and it begs the question, where, Mr. Speaker, is all of this money coming from? Mr. Speaker, simply put, this government is spending money that it doesn't have. And so what it is doing in an unprecedented fashion is that it is printing money. Mr. Speaker, to put it in some context, when this government delivered an historic $354 billion deficit, the largest deficit in Canadian history, the Bank of Canada bought 80% of the government's debt. Mr. Speaker, over the past year, we have seen a massive increase in the supply of money, a 23% increase. This is unprecedented in modern times. Indeed, you'd have to go back to the early 1970s, 50 years ago, to match the increase in the supply of money. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the face of historic deficits, the doubling of the national debt in less than 2 years as a result of this barrage of Liberal spending, the approach of this government is to say, there's no issue. We can turn on the taps and keep the tap going without consequence. During the spring of 2020, I served on the Finance Committee when this government started to turn on the tap in a big way. And I vividly recall my good friend, the member for Carleton, warning the government that all of this spending would soon lead to inflation. And I vividly recall ministers on that side of the House dismiss out of hand the warnings of the member for Carleton, notwithstanding that his concerns, his warnings, were grounded upon empirical economic science, notwithstanding that those concerns were grounded upon economic history, Oh no, they said, forget inflation, let's talk about deflation. They said the rules didn't apply to them. It's 2020, those are old rules. Interest rates are low. Now is the time to spend and double and triple down. Fast forward a year and a half, and surprise, surprise, the member for Carleton was right, and this government was wrong. Because, Mr. Speaker, we have seen record levels of inflation, 4.7% in October. Now, what does 4.7% mean? Well, Mr. Speaker, it is well more than double the Bank of Canada target of 2%, but even more worrying is that it is some 40% above the upper range of the Bank of Canada's control range of 3%. And Mr. Speaker, it is not as if this is an aberration. It is not as if this is a one-off. We have seen, Mr. Speaker, for the past 7 months, inflation above 3%, again, above the upper end of the Bank of Canada's control range of 3%, and well above the Bank of Canada's target of 2%. Recently, we heard the Prime Minister say that he doesn't think about monetary policy. Now, it's quite shocking in some level for him to say that. I mean, the idea that the Prime Minister wouldn't be thinking about monetary policy, are you kidding me? But, Mr. Speaker, to give the Prime Minister some credit, it might be the first time in the Prime Minister's life that he actually told the truth, because, Mr. Speaker, if there's one thing Canadians have learned about this Prime Minister over the past 6 years, it is that he doesn't think much about anything other than himself. And consistent with the fact that the Prime Minister doesn't think much about anything, literally in the next breath, after he said he doesn't think about monetary policy, he said he thinks about families. He thinks about families. Well, news flash to the Prime Minister. If there is any group of Canadians who are thinking about inflation, it's hard-working, everyday families.
That's right.
Because, Mr. Speaker, it is they who are paying the brunt of this Prime Minister's inflation tax. Thanks to this Prime Minister, for everyday working Canadians, prices are rising while wages are declining. Indeed, right now, inflation is growing at 2.5 times that of wages. Mr. Speaker, the cost of living is getting more expensive. The cost of essentials are going through the roof. We're talking about 30% increase for gasoline, double digits for essential food products. We have the third highest level of food inflation in the G7. Home heating, double-digit increase, Mr. Speaker. I know that doesn't mean much to the Prime Minister, but for everyday Canadians working hard to put food on the table, pay their rent or pay their mortgage, it is a big deal, especially at a time when 40% of Canadians are $200 away from insolvency. So I say, Mr. Speaker, through you, if the Prime Minister really does think about families, and he really does care about families, it's long past due that he started to think about monetary policy, that he started to think about inflation and his disastrous policies, and not only think about it, but come back to this House with a plan to get spending under control, to tamp down inflation, and to restore sound monetary policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire
Questions and comments?
in the islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I listened to what the member said, and he said, thanks to this Prime Minister, inflation is where it is. You know, suddenly the Conservatives have now come to the conclusion that the Prime Minister of Canada is capable of altering the inflation rate throughout the world. He says that inflation in Canada is amongst the highest, when actually it is well below the average of the developed countries, the OECD countries in the world. Can the member please explain how it is that the Prime Minister was able to affect global inflation in the way that he did?
Honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with the greatest respect to my friend, the member for Kingston and the Islands, under this Prime Minister's watch, inflation is the second highest in the G7. I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that is hardly a record to be proud of. And I would further note, Mr. Speaker, that the member's own finance minister has now belatedly admitted that we have an inflation crisis.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for recognizing me, and congratulations on your appointment. Let's come back to C-2 because there's lots more to talk about. Bill, C-2 will help individuals and businesses, and in fact, it contains good things, and it's not the first time you hear this. I'd like to hear my colleague on that. We are actually disappointed that there is nothing in this bill to support independent workers. So I'm wondering if my colleague can tell me whether the bill can be improved to give an official status to artists, because most of them are low-income workers. The honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Laurentides-Labelle for her question. And let me say that we on this side of the House are going to study the bill carefully, identify where there are gaps. And the member is quite right when she speaks of the cultural sector, which has been uniquely hurt as a result of COVID. And I think it speaks to a broader problem. We've seen a government that has spent a fire hose of money, giving it in many cases to people who don't need it, to sectors that don't need it, all the while leaving behind some of the hardest hit sectors. It speaks to why this government has really missed the mark. We didn't need, for the longest time, an economy-wide stimulus program. What we needed was a targeted sector-by-sector approach.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech and welcome him back to the House. We're both alumni from the class of 2015. I do want to acknowledge inflation. In the last election, affordability issues were top of mind for so many voters in Cowichan-Malahat-Langford. But we have a situation, Mr. Speaker, where when the CRB ended, there were still nearly 900,000 workers accessing that program. And in my riding, despite the fact that that program ended over a month ago, we still have so many help wanted signs. So there's a disconnect here. And I'm very concerned that when we start talking about cutting back these kinds of programs, they're usually built on the backs of Canadians who can least afford it. That's why I came to Ottawa pledging to make sure that millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share so that the working Canadians in this country are not bearing the brunt of it. I'm just wondering, Mr. Speaker, through you, if my colleague can maybe expand on that. What do we do for those very vulnerable workers who are still unable to find appropriate work and who are being left in a very precarious position by the ending of these support programs?
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
I want to thank my friend, the member for Cowichan-Malahat and Langford, for his question, and I think he raises a valid point. And we need to do our part to ensure that those who are vulnerable, those who are unable to work, those who are marginalized do have supports and aren't hung out to dry. But more broadly speaking, what we have to return to is a paycheck economy by reopening the economy and get it moving again. And unfortunately, under this government's watch, we're badly lagging behind other G7 countries.